Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Syrian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Syrian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. Tomorrow, October 6th, marks the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which Israelis and many Jews call the Yom Kippur War, because it began with a coordinated surprise attack by Egypt and Syria on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. In today's webinar, our speaker will discuss why the war broke out, whether it was inevitable, and why the Israel Defense Forces was taken by surprise and wasn't adequately prepared for it. Before I introduce him, I'd just like to say a few words about the significance of the 1973 war. There's a paradox about how the war is remembered. Egypt lost the war, but Egyptians, who call it the Ramadan War, celebrate it. To this day, the anniversary of the Egyptian army's successful crossing of the Suez Canal on October 6th is one of their biggest national holidays. Israel, on the other hand, won the war, but Israelis mourn it, and for good reason. Approximately 2,700 Israeli soldiers were killed and almost 9,000 wounded. As a proportion of Israel's population, this was more than twice the proportion of Americans who were killed in its roughly 15-year-long war in Vietnam. Israel's victory in the 1973 war, therefore, tasted more like defeat to Israelis because they had endured a massive shock and suffered many casualties. The Israeli public mood was totally different in the aftermath of the 1973 war than it had been in the aftermath of the 1967 Six-Day War. There was no jubilation or triumphalism. Instead, there was widespread anger at Israel's military and political leadership for their failure to heed the intelligence warnings and prepare the IDF for the war. In fact, Prime Minister Meir and Defense Minister Dayan were later forced to resign in April 1974 following the scathing report of the Domestic Commission of Inquiry into the war. The war, therefore, had major political repercussions in Israel, undermining the long-standing dominance of the Labour Party, which had led Israel in various guises since the country's founding, and paving the way for the electoral victory of the right-wing Likud party led by Menachem Begin in the 1977 general elections, which was a watershed in Israeli politics. As well as shattering confidence in Israel's Labour leadership, the 1973 war also forced Israelis to recognize the limits of Israel's military power. Contrary to the prevailing belief before the war, the Arab states were not deterred from attacking Israel. Furthermore, Egypt and Syria had proven that they could really hurt Israel, even if they could not defeat it. And despite its heroic performance in the 1973 war, the IDF lost the aura of invincibility that it had acquired as a result of its triumph in 1967. Thus, in contrast to the 1967 war, the 1973 war humbled Israelis and disabused them of the belief that Israel could safely hold on to Arab territories indefinitely and wait for the Arabs to capitulate and sue for peace. Consequently, the war gave Israelis the motivation to make peace that they lacked after 1967. And this helps explain, for instance, why the Israeli peace movement, led by Peace Now, emerged in the late 1970s. The war also had massive consequences regionally and globally. In the Middle East, it led to the realignment of Cold War alliances as Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, took Egypt from the Soviet camp into the US one, turning Egypt into a US client and a major recipient of American money and arms, which it still is today. Egypt's defection from its alliance with the Soviet Union was the beginning of the end of Soviet influence in the Middle East. Henceforth, the US became the only superpower that really mattered in the region. And as its diplomatic and military involvement steadily increased, it became the sole external arbiter of Middle Eastern affairs, which, of course, in turn, generated a great deal of local resentment. And finally, the oil embargo that the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC for short, the oil embargo that they imposed on the US and the Netherlands during the war due to their support for Israel had global repercussions, leading to a spike in oil prices and a worldwide recession that hit Western Europe and the United States especially hard. It also led to a lingering fear in the West that the Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, would use their oil weapon again and cause another costly global oil crisis. So the 1973 war was undoubtedly a turning point in Israel's history, in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in the history of the Middle East as a whole. To help us understand why the war took place, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Yigal Kipnis. He's an Israeli historian whose research focuses on Israel's political history. He's the author of several books, including The Mountain That Was as a Monster, the Golan Between Syria and Israel, which was published in Hebrew in 2009, 1973, The Road to War, published in Hebrew in 2012 and in English in 2013, and 1982, Lebanon, The Road to War, which was published in Hebrew in 2022 and is coming out next year in English. Dr. Kipnis received his undergraduate degree from the Technion in Haifa and his MA and PhD from the University of Haifa. He's held academic positions at the University of Haifa, the University of Georgia, and the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Dr. Kipnis also served as a pilot in the Israel Air Force for 31 years and retired with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He personally took part in the 1973 war. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kipnis. During his presentation, you're welcome to send us your questions using the Q&A box. And if we have time at the end, I will select some of those questions to ask him. So without further ado, let me now turn to Dr. Kipnis. Thank you.
Good morning, Dov. Thank you very much. And good morning to all of you. And regarding my service as a pilot, you said it correctly that I served 31 years, but most of them, about 26 as a reserves. So it is a little bit different because it means once a week to come from the north to the center. It's part of the civil life. Okay, 1973, the road to war, the war which was a culmination of the failure of political analysis. It was Kissinger's definition. And two questions I would like to emphasize, as you said, though, could the war have been prevented? And the second one, what caused Israel to not properly prepare for the war? So the events of October 73 led to investigation and a preoccupation with the question in Israel, how did this happen to us? The discussion focused on the military aspect. Accordingly, the answers and public criticism revolved around this aspect. That was natural, we can understand it. That is where the stories came from, the pictures, the dramas, the tragedies. Dealing with fighting is important for commanders, for battle heritage, for memorialization, for nostalgia, and a lot even for therapy, but not for history. The explanation that developed based on the military aspect that it was a failure of the intelligence. Indeed, the failure of the intelligence during the days that preceded the war is not in doubt. Therefore, it has been convenient to present this failure as an explanation for Israeli conduct in the days and the hours leading up to the war. However, that interpretation lacks a strong factual basis. Historical research can only be conducted many years after the events. Documentation uncovered in the archives of both Israel and the United States and the integration of the information between them show the central role of political conduct on the way to war. This makes it possible to reveal the secret channel of talks that took place between Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, Golda Meir, and Anwar Sadat, and the missed opportunity for peace negotiations before the war. It reduces and almost eliminates the role of intelligence failure in decision-making. It does not negate, but minimizes the role of the military command in the chaos at the beginning of the war. We have to remember, war is more than just a fighting. And in order to conduct historical research, at least two additional aspects must be investigated about the period. The first, the social cultural aspect, and the other, the political aspect. So let us say a few words regarding the first one. we have to speak about the period between summer 67 and autumn 73, the period of euphoria in Israel. Israel society ignored or did not correctly evaluate several negative effects, transitioning from the joy of victory to hubris and national arrogance, developing the admiration for the army, military power, and military leadership, belittling the Egyptian army and President Sadat. And in general, I can say that the public in Israel was not aware of the sensors required for society to identify conduct that could lead to a national disaster before it happened. Now, we will go on to the political aspects, the main subject of our talking. At the beginning of 73, there was a change in the views of President Nixon and his national security advisor, Kissinger, regarding the Middle East conflict. The former approach, conducting only a appearance of negotiation, as Nixon told me here at the end of December 71, was changed to an initiative for negotiations between Israel and Egypt. Decision makers in Israel had to choose between two alternatives. The first, to accept Nixon's and Kissinger's initiative and Kissinger's outline for peace negotiation between Israel and Egypt based on Sadat proposal, or to wait for war, which would break out during the second half of the summer, as Dayan said. It was a war that Sadat had ordered the Egyptian army to prepare in order to motivate a political process if Kissinger delayed his initiative. Golda and Dayan chose the second alternative, war. Although they knew months in advance that a political demand would prevent the IDF from using the advantage of initiative, which was pivotal to the success of the 67 war. And the army would be forced to respond to an attack by Egyptian and Syrian military forces, limited by its ability to prepare it in advance. Kissinger, in order to open negotiations, asked Golda if she would be willing to deviate from her demand for change in the recognized international border. Even before that, he had told her, say that you want peace in stages, and then you will be able to explain the various problems involved, a tactical advice. Golda replied negatively to Kissinger. But to Dayan and Galili, Minister Galili, she explained, regarding Kissinger cockroach, we have to tell him again, and we have told him this many times, that is not our conception. Our conception is the demand to annex a third of Sinai. We may criticize Golda Meir for her position, and a lot do it. We may justify her, and there are some who are doing it. But we cannot avoid these facts and argue that they never occurred. And some are doing it now. Kissinger was waiting until after elections in Israel for his political initiative. After the elections, he started an accelerated political process. But in the interim, the war broke out. The interpretation that the war was unavoidable belongs to apologetic writing. The arguments that Egyptians did not intend to achieve a peace agreement has no factual ground. Golda and Dayan preferred war, even though they knew months in advance that in contrast to 67, a political requirement would prevent the IDF for mobilizing reserves and being the first to attack. On basis of this dictation, the Chief of Staff, Dado David Elazar, prepared plans for war. Already in May 73, when he presented these plans to Golda and Dayan, he said, "I am operating on the assumption that we cannot open with a preemptive attack." He said it in May. And regarding mobilization of the reserves, he said, "We do not want, nor do we propose to mobilize the reserves on the large scale or do anything else that might escalate the situation into war." The dictate that limiting the Chief of Staff remained in force during the days before the war as well. At noon of the 5th of October, a day before Yom Kippur, the government was hurriedly called to report to its members that war might break out the next day. And regarding the question that came up of who had the authority to decide in such a case on calling up the reserves, Dado said, "There are only two things for which, during the war, we will need to approval, and they are of the greatest importance. The first was the mobilization of reserves, and to what extent. During the war," he said, because he knew he was not permitted to do that before the war broke out. Even on the morning of the war, Golda and Dayan refused to approve a preemptive airborne strike. And Dayan replied to Dado's request to call up the reserves. Mobilizing the reserves is an act of war. So 50 years after the war, it is time to completely free ourselves from the incorrect explanation that the intelligence failure brought the state of Israel to the most traumatic experience in its history. The failure of the intelligence to assess the probability of war was revealed when the war broke out. Thus, many have adopted this reasoning as an explanation for the chaos at the beginning of the war, which continued in part as fighting went on. This explanation is easy to accept, but it is not correct. A discussion of political conduct goes behind the desire to understand how did it happen to us 50 years ago. The complexity of making decisions and the mutual relationship between the political and military echelons always exist. Even today, an investigation of 73 events is a good case study. The discussion also included an historiographical aspect, the role of the apologetic, the personal apologetic and the national apologetic, in the formulating the most exact and correct historical story. Now to the question, what was alternative that the Israeli decision makers had instead of waiting for war? Until early 73, and as long as the Soviet represented Egyptian interest, Kissinger worked to thwart policy initiatives led by the State Department, by Rogers, the secretary. Kissinger and Nixon's goal was to thwart the Egyptian belief that salvation would come from Moscow. This is Rabin wrote to Golda Meir, Rabin's ambassador at the time, to induce Sadat to turn to Washington for political and military backing, to be the sole mediator in the regional conflict, to keep the Soviets out of the region. As 73 approached, the objectives of Sadat and those of the Americans were combined. Sadat wanted to replace Soviet patronage with that of the United States, and he viewed the return of Egyptian sovereignty over Sinai with a peace agreement as part of this step. After he established his rule over Egypt, and it was not so easy to do it, and end distance pro-Soviet elements from the Egyptian leadership, Sadat operated simultaneously on two tracks. The first, political track, he established a secret channel with Kissinger, directly with Kissinger to the White House, not to the State Department. And a military track, preparations for a limited war to motivate a political process if his peace initiative was not accepted. Both aimed to initiate a political process. The joint objective create a change in the political realities in the Middle East. Kissinger, via the British, presented Sadat with his principle for his mediation between Israel and Egypt. An end to hostilities, a partial agreement that would enable the opening of the canal, Suez Canal. After that, negotiations for permanent agreed upon border. And very important, the problems of Gaza, the Golan, and Jerusalem would not be discussed. This would be the basis to start negotiations at the end of February, with direct communication between Sadat and Kissinger. Hafez Ismail, the Sadat envoy, arrived in Washington at the same time as Golda Meir's visit, end of February. And let us see the marathon of conversation. First, Nixon, Kissinger, Ismail, and then 2 days of discussion between Kissinger and Ismail, and you can see the highlights, but I will come soon deeply to the details. Next, at the end of the second day, Kissinger, Nixon. Then the day after, Kissinger, Hussein. And on the same day, Kissinger, Rabin, to prepare the next day, the meeting between Kissinger and Golda Meir. To prepare the next day, the meeting between Nixon and Meir. And the most important, Kissinger, Rabin meeting, and the day after, Kissinger, Rabin telephone conversation. So let us examine the events. A day before clarification talks, Kissinger presented a mode of action to Nixon, as he wrote, to break the deadlock between the Arabs and the Israelis. They agreed to operate parallelly on two tracks. The first would be open and would lead to a partial agreement. The second was secret and was meant to discuss the principles of peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. Kissinger said to Nixon, it will stand or fall on whether Israel can be convinced to think in terms of restoring Egyptian sovereignty over most of the Sinai, while retaining control at strategic points rather than insisting on permanent change in boundaries. In a series of official and unofficial talks, they examined the positions of the parties before the start of the negotiation and the degree of the flexibility they would show so that they could conclude with an agreement. On February 24th, Ismail met with the president and Kissinger. And the president advised him as a lawyer, why do you have to reveal your position at the very first meeting? Put the cards close to you. This is how Ismail behaved during the next 2 days when a secret met with Kissinger. As required at this stage of the process, Ismail presented rigid Egyptian positions, but also left an opening for flexibility and the basis for future investigation. 2 days of discussions were held in a closed apartment, enabling time for unofficial talks as well. And as we know, during such talks, released from protocol, important aspects were clarified. Kissinger was the only one who had this knowledge. So the Egyptian position and their readiness for flexibility can only be known as Kissinger presented and summarized it. Sadat aimed for an agreement on understandings with Americans first, that would recognize Egyptian sovereignty over Sinai by the United States. Already in their opening position, even before negotiations, the Egyptians were ready to distinguish between recognition of Egyptian sovereignty over Sinai and willingness that this would not be implemented in full for many years. According to Ismail, this would allow the Egyptian sovereignty to be combined with the legitimate security concerns of Israel. Ismail explains that recognition of sovereignty is solid enough for them, for the Egyptians, to defend their own people, yet flexible enough to accommodate practical arrangements that may be necessary. Sadat wanted to separate the talks with Israel from the other channels of the conflict, the Syrians, the Palestinians, which he assumed would delay his initiative. But Sadat also aware that the Arab world would not accept it. He dealt with these difficulties, and he explained that he would be the pioneer. As Egypt and Israel move through the above stages, Syria and Jordan would be roughly one stage behind. And a Syrian settlement had to be based on the same principle as Egypt's. And regarding the Palestinians, they said, Egypt would consider whatever King Hussein worked out with the West Bank Palestinians as an internal Jordanian matter, not an Arab-Israeli matter. Kissinger said and understood, Egypt is already willing to make a separate peace. Does it remind you something? This was implemented by Sadat 6 years later in peace agreement with Israel. Sadat was aiming at full peace, but he saw the need to reach peace in stages and thought that it would take a long time. He did not make demands, but requested that Kissinger propose an outline for mediation. As he said, you will listen to us, ask questions, how we see one thing or another, and then meet with the Israelis and listen to their point of view. You will have 2 points of view, and perhaps then you will be able to create something that will fit both viewpoints. You will have an outline, and you will ask each side how they feel about it. Kissinger and Nixon response to Sadat's initiative. On February 26, Kissinger updated Nixon about the Egyptian willingness to see 2 main stages in advancing a real peace. But what Kissinger told Nixon, that the outline they agreed upon is feasible, and that if the Egyptians continue to cooperate, Israel will not be able to oppose it. By summer, Kissinger said to Nixon, we will be able to connect the 2 tracks, and that will be will get the rations of us. We can wrap it up by September 1st, and that will be a big achievement. They discussed ways to putting pressure on Israel. And in the next 2 days, Kissinger updated Rabin, the Ambassador Rabin, and Golda about the talks with Ismail. He said, there is a new Egyptian approach, he said to Golda, but I would only try if you and I agree. And again, I do not want to talk to the Egyptians as long as there is no understanding between us. Golda immediately responded, then we will just not go along with this. Golda rejected outright the opening of negotiations with Sadat because she did not trust him. She later agreed that Kissinger would continue to maintain contact with Ismail, but rejected negotiations that would require the abandonment of her demand for the annexation of large part of Sinai to Israel. And now Rabin Kissinger, and based on the American documentation that we can see in the background, Kissinger presented Rabin with his timetable for reaching an agreement by September 73, the details of which are not mentioned in the American document. But at the last sentence, it was written, for the next 10 minutes, Dr. Kissinger and the ambassador conferred alone. Now we have the Israeli document, and this is why the integration between the document is very, very important. And based on the Israeli document, Kissinger also presented Rabin with the details of his outline. You can see the Hebrew document. It is written, the discussion began with Rodman, but after 10 minutes, Shaul asked him to leave the room, and Wick remained alone. And Rabin reported, Kissinger summarized all of his expectations for concessions from the prime minister in the question, would we, Israel, he reported, be willing to deviate from our position of demanding significant border changes in comparison to the international border between Israel and Egypt? Rabin conversed with Golda by phone, a discussion he described as long and difficult. And when he tried unsuccessfully to convince her to accept Kissinger's outline, he presented 3 stages of Kissinger's outline. First, by September 1st, the Israeli withdrawal from the Suez Canal would be completed. It will open for sailing, and there would be a declaration of the framework of a permanent peace agreement that would also include recognition of Egyptian sovereignty over Sinai. According to the Egyptians, the basic principles of the agreement would be decided on by September, but their implementation could continue for long after the end of 73. Ismail explained, they, the Israelis, have to bring question of war and peace to their nation, and we will see what a nation in Israel will say to that. It should be an election in Israel in October, end of October. The Egyptians did not demand full implementation of the withdrawal with the signing of the agreement, and Kissinger certainly did not demand that. And Rabin responded to what Kissinger told him, say July or August, which will be very unpleasant for the prime minister, that is 2 or 3 months before our election. The second stage of Kissinger outline would begin in September. There would be discussion of details of the agreement, the ways to implement it, and in the commitment of both sides to carry out these details. According to Ismail, If the process is conducted seriously, Egypt will not feel it necessary to set a deadline. The third stage would be implementation of the agreement in stages until full normalization. It would continue for many years. During this period, Egyptian forces would mainly be in the region of the Canal, the east of the peninsula. Israeli forces would partially be stationed in the east of Sinai and at key points on the peninsula, most of which would be demilitarized to separate the two sides. Kissinger was aware of a mutual suspicion accompanying such a process, and thus insisted on peace in stages and over a long period of time. Based on Ismail's words, for Israeli security needs to have force at vital points in Sinai. In order to able advance his outline, Kissinger requested to know whether Israel was willing to give up its demand to annex a wide area in Sinai. Kissinger did not set any other condition for Israel in order to begin negotiations. This was the outline that was presented to Israel. This was the outline that Golda rejected. Golda and Dayan's reaction to Kissinger initiative. On April 18, Golda's kitchen cabinet, Golda, Dayan, and Galili, discussed the targeted alerts about a war in May that came in April, based on consideration that sooner or later they were moving toward war, as Dayan said in this meeting. During this discussion, Galili forced Golda to relate to the question, is there anything that we could do so that will not happen? Golda tried to avoid dealing with Galili's inquiries, but Galili did not give up. And you can read what he says. All these developments stem from the fact that we do not agree to return to the previous line. If you take Hafez, Ismail said to Shaul is Kissinger, and the paper he left with him, then the starting point is that they are ready for peace and for system of arrangements and international assurance and so forth, and all of that on condition that we completely withdraw to the previous line. They knew exactly what was on the table. And Galili emphasized, they have come out with a formula of sovereignty on Egyptian soil, which takes into consideration the security needs of Israel, sovereignty for security. Golda left no room for doubt in her refusal to accept Kissinger's outline, the cockroach, as in her words. Galili disagreed with her. He stressed the cost of war and proposed an investigation of a tactical aspect. He said that a positive reply to Kissinger would distance a war, would begin reconciliation steps, and would earn possession credit for Israel, leading to political steps in the future. Dayan and Golda also refused to notify the cabinet of the alternative to war. As Dayan said, I would suggest that this should be placed before that. I would not suggest that this should be placed before the government in Israel in this context. That is, are we willing to go to war only on condition that we don't return to Green Line? A month later, the British Foreign Minister Alec Douglas-Home met with Kissinger in London and informed him There had recently been a tough message for Marwan to that effect that President Sadat would initiate some attacks before long. He mentioned Ashraf Marwan, the advisor of Sadat, but parallel an agent of the Israeli Mossad, as a transmitter of the information whose source and content Israel withheld from the Americans. 3 days later, Kissinger again asked Golda to accept the outline. And he said, why could not you take it in a form of security zones instead of annexation? Sovereignty would remain in Egyptian hands, but you would be there in practice. And I would like to be sure, my estimate of what you want is a straight line west from El Arish. It's mean a big part of Sinai, 1/3 of Sinai. And Dini's answer was, it might not be a straight line, but in general terms, you are right. 2 months later, Golda did not hesitate to declare in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, we responded to every offer that had reasonable degree of seriousness, even if it had a little weight. September 30, it was 6 days before the war broke out. The deployment of the Egyptian and Syrian forces on the front was known to American intelligence as well to the Israeli. Israelis sought to downplay the significance of the military tensions to Kissinger and hid it from the Israeli public. At the request of the censor, the newspapers refrained from reporting on the military tensions. Kissinger, already Secretary of State, sent Meir his plans for negotiation to begin after the elections. Dinitz returned from consultation in Israel and on the program. Kissinger urgently called Dinitz, and this is Dinitz's report from September 30. I was called to a meeting with Naftali, now Kissinger is Naftali. I was asked to come alone. Here I gave him a word-for-word translation of your telegram. That is, we are not of the opinion that the present situation is ideal, but a period of elections is not convenient time for serious discussion. Kissinger's reply, transmitted by Dinitz, here Naftali mentioned that when he had formulated the common strategy with us 2 years ago, remember December 71, he had followed it completely and neither of us had lost as a result. But that horse was dead. It is important right now to formulate a new common strategy. Kissinger continued to wait until after the elections in Israel to start after them an accelerated political process to implement his outline. As we well know, he did so, but the elections took place only after the war. The interpretation that was inevitable belongs to the realm of unknown. Who knows? However, the examination of the political alternative to war belongs to the well-known field based on facts. The price for preferring war became clear in the chaos that prevailed in the Israeli decision-making process when the war did break out. And now for the second question. Prevention of both preemptive attack and reserves call up was a political demand. It had been agreed to many months before the war and remained in place during the hours before war broke out. In 1967, Levi Eshkol, the prime minister at that time, created the political conditions that enabled the IDF to act preemptively, dictating the conditions and acting to surprise. In 73, Golda and Dayan dictated a political demand which eliminated the advantage of a preemptive strike, was the main reason that the success of 67 was not repeated in 73. Golda's and Dayan's political considerations in the months, days, and hours preceding the war were not based on the assessment of the intelligence services. Each of these considerations stood on its own and strengthened the others. The first, Golda's commitment to Kissinger to wait more than 2 hours, and I will say a few words about it. The second, political conception and assessment of the low probability of war due to political considerations. And domestic political consideration, election time now, as Golda said, or Dayan, the whole business is not worth it to us now. It's mean required to calm down. Political consideration, to prevent Kissinger from leveraging the tension into negotiation and the illusion of deterrence. Now, a few words regarding Golda's commitment. Again, to the document, December 71, Rabin-Kissinger meeting, and it was written, the ambassador met last night with Cardinal and Uriah, 2 days after Flint returned from his meeting with East. So we know that Flint is a president, Uriah is Alexander Haig, and Cardinal that time was Kissinger. And the question came up, what if Sadat realizes his threats and attacks? Kissinger's reaction was, in that case, which he did not believe would happen, it would help if Israel waited longer than 2 hours with its reaction. So wait more than 2 hours, the price Israel paid for the understandings in December 71. Appearance of negotiation and supply of the arm, the Skyhawks and the Phantoms. The commitment was built into the war plans that Dado presented to Golda and Dayan in May, as we said. This sentence of commitment remained in place even on the morning of the war. Diniz said to Golda 2 hours before the war, Kissinger always told me that what would be was not important. Don't be the first ones to attack. And Golda replied. He also said this to Rabin. Do you think I have forgotten? No, she did not. And few words regarding the political conception. Although they knew that Egyptian and Syrian deployment would allow them to immediately initiate war, Golda and Dayan assumed that Sadat would prevent a breakout of war and wait for the results of Kissinger's moves after the Israeli elections. Dayan said very clearly, I don't expect a renewal of war in the battlefields, but do expect a difficult political struggle. And also, Egyptians would now prefer an additional political round to a military round. And Tzvika Zamir, the head of the Mossad, said to Marwan a few hours before the war, what would be the logic to initiating war? Initiating war now would harm the recent Egyptian political achievements and the chance of reaching understandings with Kissinger. So the political consideration of Golda and Dayan was the main cause of the chaos at the front and not the misjudgment of the intelligence. The wrong information about the exact time of the war increased it. Israel, what do we do now? Golda asked Israel or her secretary, who had just informed her at 4 in the morning, Yom Kippur, that war would break out that evening. More than 4 hours passed until a forum met to discuss and decide on the extent of reserves needed and their mobilization. The chaos demonstrated that in times of extreme pressure, even talented and experienced people may make mistakes. This fact of life should be considered by decision makers when posing constraints to the army, or negating a political alternative. I can say that the leaders of Israel and Egypt aspire at peace, no doubt about it. Golda and Sadat. But Sadat, whose goals were to join forces with the United States, and in the framework of peace to return Sinai to Egyptian sovereignty, achieved this goal. While Israel erred in the illusion that it could obtain considerable territories as well as achieving peace, as Kissinger assessed the Israeli failure. And after the war, Kissinger remarked to Meir, "I don't want to blame anyone, but during 73, the war could have been avoided. I cannot see that it could be avoided, but I can see that we could trust to do it." So thank you. And if you have any question, we can go on.
Okay, we only have a few minutes. I have quite a lot of questions. I'm going to just try to zoom out a little bit and focus on, I think, some of the major arguments that you've made in your presentation. First and foremost, the argument that contrary to I think prevailing understanding about the war, it was primarily a political failure rather than an intelligence failure. In other words, it was Israel's political leadership that was to blame, you've argued, and not its intelligence and defense establishment. And I think that's a really, really important point for people to come away with. And I think you linked this political failure to the reluctance or outright refusal of the Israeli government at the time, led by Prime Minister Golda Meir, to withdraw from parts of the Sinai Peninsula that Israel had occupied in 1967. I think it's worth then maybe saying a few words about why the Israeli government, why Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, and indeed many Israelis, if not most Israelis, were so determined to hold on to the Sinai Peninsula, even at the cost of peace with Egypt. Why was it, more important to have Sharm el-Sheikh than peace?
I think it's very simple. We have the power. We won 67. It will be the same in the next war. So we can ask and ultimately ask for annexation. It's very, very simple. It is belong to the euphoria period between 67 and 73.
So one other question I have in terms of the understanding of the war, to this day, many people in Israel and indeed elsewhere think of the war as yet another Arab effort to eliminate Israel. The popular view, I think, has traditionally been that, this was a war like previous wars aimed at, quote unquote, driving the Jews into the sea or wiping Israel off the map. In fact, as you've laid out very clearly, that wasn't Sadat's intention. It was, as you put it, a limited war. Do you think Israelis, to what extent are Israelis to this day aware of this? Do they still see this as a kind of an eliminationist war? Or is there a recognition that, in fact, at least as far as Sadat was concerned, this war was a limited war that wasn't aimed at destroying Israel?
Your question is regarding nowadays, but we have to understand that time we learned the lesson, and the peace agreement with Egypt, which signed by Menachem Begin, based on what you say, we understand something. But I'm not sure we remember, and we cannot distinguish between that we have to be, we have to have the power, but we have limited to use it. We have to know how to use this power. We cannot solve everything by power. We have to base our strategy on two steps: power and agreements.
So one, I think, aspect, one decision maker during the war that you didn't pay as much attention to was Syria's president, Hafez al-Assad. obviously Syria, along with Egypt, was a participant in this. Could you say something a little bit about his decision-making in going to war? Was his objective also limited in the way that Sadat's was, or was Assad more interested in seeking to kind of recapture, reconquer the Golan Heights, or even destroy Israel?
So that goal was political. He want a peace with Israel. It's very, very clear. We can understand why. It is very. It is better to be a friend of the United States or make a peace in Israel and get the territory, the peninsula, back with no war. The Syrians is quite different story. They don't want peace, so Sadat used it, and he paid for it during the war because all the story of the Third Army. We don't discuss it a lot, but he have to pay this for the Syrians because he cheats them. He told them he playing a big war and he playing a limited war.
So he kind of misled, he tricked Assad basically into going to war. One other, we're almost out of time, but I feel like there's a couple of other important questions about the war and the way we think about it that I'd like to ask you to kind of quickly. I know we only have a couple of minutes. First of all, you spent a lot of time talking about Nixon and Kissinger's role in the run-up to the war. But I would like you to say something a little bit about their role during the war, and specifically the claim that's been made, and I'm sure you've heard it many times, that they deliberately delayed the resupply of American weapons to Israel. That although eventually they agreed to this massive resupply, they held it up in order to kind of achieve some objectives. Do you share that view of their decision making with regards to the resupply of weapons during the war?
Your question is during the war.
Yeah, during the war itself.
Because you have to understand, Kissinger is a secretary at that time of the United States, and the main goals of him was to push the Soviet from this area. So before the war, he don't want any. Before 73, don't want any negotiation, because any negotiation, it's mean the Soviet Union will be involved. During the war, is what you ask about, he don't want Israel, who are under the umbrella of United States, will not win the war. So in the beginning, he understands that it will take 1 or 2 days, and Israel will make the job again. After 4 or 5 days, he understood that this is not the situation. He changed dramatically his direction and supplies weapons to Israel.
So as far as you're concerned, there was no deliberate effort to hold up the resupply?
Delete has been a point of view of whom? For Kissinger, it is exactly according to his interest.
I see. And finally, we're out of time, but I have to ask, there's also been a lot of discussion and speculation about Israel's threat or alleged threat during the war to employ its nuclear weapons, the so-called Samson option. Do you think that was a credible threat, or was it a bluff?
It was. I can say very shortly, it is a bluff. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you. Thank you for answering all of those questions very quickly. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, for joining us today. I want to thank also all of our audience members. A reminder that we will be posting this webinar on our website and on our YouTube channel. So please spread the word, and hopefully I will see you all again at our next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.